I worked full-time to pay rent, then found out my brother was living for free. My name is Emma Chen, and I am 29 years old. The moment I discovered the truth about my living situation while helping my brother pack for what I thought was his move to a new apartment changed everything I believed about my family. I had been working double shifts as a nurse and waiting tables on weekends just to afford rent on my cramped one-bedroom apartment across town, while my brother Daniel was living completely rent-free in our grandmother's beautiful Victorian house that I thought had been sold years ago. Before I tell you how this revelation led to the biggest family confrontation of my life, drop a like and subscribe to hear how one shocking discovery unraveled decades of lies and manipulation. The story begins 3 years ago when I moved back to Portland, Oregon, after completing my nursing degree in Seattle. Fresh out of college with student loans crushing my monthly budget, I desperately needed affordable housing while I established my career. My family claimed there were no options available through our relatives, so I ended up in a sketchy neighborhood paying $800 monthly for a space barely larger than a dorm room. My grandmother Lily had passed away 2 years before my return, leaving behind the gorgeous 3-story Victorian home where I had spent countless childhood weekends. The house sat on a tree-lined street in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that had been my favorite reading spot during summer visits. According to my parents, Grandmother Lily's house had been sold immediately after her death to cover medical bills and funeral expenses. The explanation made sense given the family's financial struggles, and I accepted their decision without question. The sale was supposedly handled quickly to avoid ongoing maintenance costs that none of us could afford. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to be thriving in his post-college life, despite graduating with a liberal arts degree that offered limited career prospects. He worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer, picking up projects when he felt motivated, yet somehow maintained a lifestyle that suggested substantial income from mysterious sources. During family gatherings, Daniel would mention living in various apartments around the city, but details about his housing arrangements remained vague. When I asked direct questions about his rent or roommate situations, he would deflect with jokes or change the subject to my nursing career challenges. The contrast between our financial situations was stark and increasingly difficult to ignore. While I worked exhausting 12-hour shifts at the hospital, followed by evening shifts waiting tables just to cover basic living expenses, Daniel appeared to have unlimited free time for hobbies, travel, and social activities that required discretionary income I could not imagine possessing. My typical week involved clocking in at Portland General Hospital at 6 a.m. for a 12-hour nursing shift, then rushing across town to work at Romano's Italian restaurant until midnight. The schedule left me perpetually exhausted and barely able to maintain social relationships outside of brief interactions with coworkers during shift changes. The physical demands of nursing combined with the emotional stress of serving demanding restaurant customers created a level of fatigue that affected every aspect of my life. I would collapse into my tiny apartment each night, too tired to cook proper meals or maintain friendships that required energy I simply did not possess. Meanwhile, Daniel's social media posts showed him hiking scenic trails on weekday afternoons, attending art gallery openings, and taking spontaneous weekend trips to the coast. His lifestyle suggested either extraordinary financial management skills or income sources he had never disclosed to family members who worried about his career stability. During monthly family dinners at my parents' house, the disparity between our circumstances became increasingly apparent. I would arrive exhausted from work, often still wearing scrubs because I had no time to change between shifts, while Daniel appeared relaxed and well-rested with stories about creative projects and social adventures. My parents, Robert and Susan Chen, seemed oblivious to the inequality in our situations, despite clear evidence of our different financial realities. They would ask about my work stress while praising Daniel's artistic pursuits and creative independence, as though his lifestyle choices were more admirable than my practical career decisions. The conversations often left me feeling resentful and confused about family dynamics that seemed to reward Daniel's lack of traditional responsibility, while my dedication to stable employment earned only polite acknowledgement. The pattern felt familiar from childhood, but more pronounced now that we were adults with real financial obligations. My apartment situation was particularly frustrating, because the building management company seemed to delight in finding reasons to increase fees and penalties. Late rent payments due to paycheck timing resulted in $50 penalties that stretched my already tight budget to breaking points that required borrowing money from credit cards. The neighborhood itself presented daily safety concerns that added stress to my already overwhelming schedule. Walking home from late restaurant shifts meant navigating poorly lit streets where homeless camps had established semi-permanent presence and drug activity occurred openly, despite frequent police patrols. Break-ins were common enough that I had invested in multiple locks and a security system that added $30 monthly to my housing costs. The expense felt necessary for basic safety, but represented another financial burden that Daniel appeared to avoid through his mysterious housing arrangements. My one-bedroom apartment measured approximately 400 square feet and featured outdated appliances that broke down regularly, requiring repair costs or replacement expenses that landlord refused to cover. The refrigerator died twice in 6 months, forcing me to replace spoiled food and eat restaurant meals that destroyed my carefully planned grocery budget. The heating system worked sporadically during Portland's wet winters, resulting in utility bills that fluctuated wildly and sometimes consumed nearly half my monthly income. The unpredictability made financial planning impossible and forced me to choose between adequate heating and other basic necessities like proper nutrition. Daniel's living situation, by contrast, seemed remarkably stable and comfortable based on his casual references to home amenities and neighborhood perks. He mentioned features like a dishwasher, in-unit laundry, and reliable parking without expressing the gratitude I would have felt for such luxuries. My student loan payments consumed $400 monthly, leaving me with barely enough income to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and transportation costs. The calculation required such precise budgeting that unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills created financial crises that took months to resolve. The nursing job, while providing steady income and health insurance, paid significantly less than I had anticipated when choosing the profession. Hospital administration seemed determined to minimize labor costs through understaffing that increased patient loads beyond safe or sustainable levels for individual nurses. Mandatory overtime was common but unpredictable, making it impossible to maintain consistent schedules at the restaurant job that provided necessary supplemental income. The conflict between jobs created constant stress about disappointing employers while meeting financial obligations that required both paychecks. Restaurant work provided cash tips that helped cover immediate expenses, but the income was irregular and dependent on factors beyond my control like weather, local events, and customer mood variations. Slow nights could mean earning $20 for 6 hours of work, while busy evenings might generate enough tips to cover groceries for the week. The combination of physical exhaustion and financial stress was affecting my health in ways that concerned colleagues and family members. Weight loss from irregular eating, chronic fatigue, and frequent illness suggested that my current lifestyle was unsustainable long-term. My parents expressed concern about my appearance and energy levels during family gatherings, but offered no concrete assistance beyond suggesting I consider moving to a less expensive city or finding a different career. Their advice felt disconnected from the reality of student loan obligations and career investment that made major changes impossible. Daniel's response to my obvious struggles was casual sympathy, mixed with suggestions that I learn to manage stress better or find more efficient work approaches. His tone suggested that my problems resulted from poor planning rather than genuine economic challenges affecting many young professionals. The advice was particularly frustrating because it came from someone whose financial situation remained mysterious despite apparent comfort and stability. Daniel never discussed money concerns or work pressures that characterized my daily existence, suggesting either remarkable financial success or support systems he had not disclosed. 6 months ago, the situation reached a crisis point when my car required $800 in transmission repairs that I could not afford without borrowing money from credit cards already carrying balances I struggled to manage. The debt was becoming overwhelming despite my best efforts to maintain financial responsibility. Daniel offered to lend me the money, but seemed surprised by my desperation and inability to cover such an expense independently. His casual attitude toward the amount suggested that $800 represented a minor inconvenience rather than a financial emergency that could affect housing stability. The loan conversation revealed the extent of our different financial realities, without providing insight into the source of Daniel's apparent security. He mentioned having savings, but deflected questions about his income sources or long-term financial planning strategies. My parents suggested I apply for additional credit cards or consider a personal loan to cover the car repairs. advice that ignored the underlying problem of insufficient income to support my basic living expenses. Their solutions focused on managing debt, rather than addressing the fundamental inequality in my situation. The breaking point came last month, when my landlord announced a rent increase of $150 monthly, effective immediately due to neighborhood improvements and increased property values. The additional expense would consume most of my remaining discretionary income and force me to find a third job or move to an even less desirable area. Moving costs would include security deposits, utility connections, and truck rental that could easily exceed $2,000 I did not possess. The prospect of relocating while maintaining demanding work schedules felt overwhelming and potentially impossible without family assistance. When I mentioned the rent increase during Sunday dinner, my parents expressed sympathy but no offers of financial help. Daniel suggested I negotiate with the landlord or find a roommate, advice that demonstrated his lack of understanding about my housing situation and available options. The conversation was particularly frustrating because it occurred in their comfortable suburban home while I faced potential homelessness due to circumstances largely beyond my control. The disconnect between their secure housing and my precarious situation highlighted economic inequalities within our own family. 2 weeks ago, Daniel mentioned casually that he was moving to a new place and asked if I could help with packing over the weekend. The request seemed reasonable, and I welcomed the opportunity to spend time together while contributing to his transition to what I assumed would be another apartment. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that matched my mood as I drove across town to help Daniel pack. The address he had provided was in the Alphabet District, one of Portland's most expensive neighborhoods where Victorian homes sold for well over $1 million. I assumed Daniel was helping a friend or client with their move, given the location's incompatibility with any housing he could afford on freelance graphic design income. The neighborhood featured tree-lined streets with meticulously maintained historical homes that represented generational wealth, far beyond our family's economic reality. Parking required circling several blocks before finding space on a side street where residents clearly invested significant money in landscaping and exterior maintenance. The area felt like a different world compared to my neighborhood's neglected infrastructure and absent property management. Walking toward the address Daniel had provided, I admired the architectural details and mature gardens that characterized homes built during Portland's early development. The craftsmanship and preservation represented the kind of lifestyle I associated with established professionals and inherited wealth. The house number Daniel had given me corresponded to a magnificent 3-story Victorian with original architectural details intact and recent renovations that enhanced rather than compromised its historical character. The wraparound porch featured intricate woodwork and stained glass elements that seemed familiar despite the upscale neighborhood context. As I approached the front door, recognition hit me like physical force that left me struggling to breathe normally. This was not some random house where Daniel was helping with a move. This was Grandmother Lily's house, the property my family claimed had been sold years ago to cover funeral expenses and medical bills. The realization that I was standing in front of our grandmother's supposedly sold house created confusion and anger that made logical thinking difficult. Every detail matched my childhood memories. The purple front door, the rose garden along the side yard, the distinctive bay windows with original stained glass panels. Standing on the familiar porch where I had spent countless hours reading during summer visits, I felt betrayed by my own family in ways that seemed impossible to comprehend or forgive. The house that represented some of my happiest childhood memories had been hidden from me while I struggled with housing insecurity and financial stress. Daniel answered the door with his usual casual demeanor, apparently unaware that his secret was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. He was dressed comfortably in clothes that looked expensive, and his relaxed attitude suggested he had no idea that I had just realized the truth about his living situation. "Emma, perfect timing. I've got most of the books packed, but I could use help with the kitchen stuff," he said, stepping aside to let me enter the house that I thought had been lost forever. The interior was exactly as I remembered, with Grandmother Lily's furniture and decorations preserved as though she had never died. The familiar smell of her lavender sachets still lingered in the hallway, and family photos that I thought had been distributed among relatives remained displayed on the mantelpiece. Everything about the house suggested continuous occupation, rather than sale and new ownership. Walking through rooms filled with childhood memories, while processing Daniel's deception, created emotional chaos that made speaking difficult. The dining room where Grandmother Lily had taught me to play chess still contained her antique table and chairs. The kitchen maintained her collection of vintage teapots, and the herb garden visible through windows she had tended until her final illness. "Daniel," I managed to say, my voice shaking with emotions I was still trying to identify and control. "This is Grandmother Lily's house, the house that was supposedly sold after she died. The house where I could have been living instead of struggling in that terrible apartment across town." His expression changed immediately from casual friendliness to obvious panic as he realized his secret living arrangement had been discovered. The color drained from his face, and he began stammering explanations that sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. "Emma, I can explain everything. It's not what you think. The family decided that someone should live here to maintain the property, while we figured out what to do with it long term. I was just helping out by staying here temporarily until we could make permanent decisions." The explanation was clearly fabricated and insulting to my intelligence. The house showed evidence of comfortable long-term occupation, with Daniel's personal belongings integrated throughout the space and improvements that suggested significant time and financial investment in making the property his home. "How long have you been living here?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would confirm my worst fears about the timeline of his deception and my family's complicity in maintaining the lie that had affected my housing decisions for years. "About 2.5 years, he admitted reluctantly, confirming that he had been living rent-free in our grandmother's house for almost the entire time I had been struggling with housing costs and working multiple jobs to afford basic shelter. The revelation that Daniel had been living comfortably in our family home, while I exhausted myself working double shifts to afford substandard housing in a dangerous neighborhood, felt like betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined possible. The revelation that Daniel had been living comfortably in our family home while I exhausted myself working double shifts to afford substandard housing in a dangerous neighborhood felt like betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined possible. 2.5 years of lies while I struggled to survive financially in a city where my own family owned property that could have solved all my problems. 2.5 years, I repeated, my voice rising with each word. "You've been living here for 2.5 years while I've been killing myself working 60-hour weeks just to afford rent on that horrible apartment. Do Mom and Dad know about this arrangement?" Daniel's silence was answer enough. The guilty expression on his face confirmed that my parents were not only aware of his rent-free living situation, but had actively participated in deceiving me about the house's availability. The conspiracy involved my entire immediate family working together to ensure Daniel's comfort, while allowing me to struggle unnecessarily. "Emma, please let me explain the full situation before you get upset," Daniel said, his tone shifting to the patronizing voice he had used since childhood, whenever caught in wrongdoing. "The house needed someone to live in it for security purposes. Empty Victorian homes in this neighborhood are targets for break-ins and vandalism. I was doing the family a favor by staying here." The explanation was so absurd that I almost laughed despite my anger. Daniel was attempting to frame his rent-free living arrangement as a sacrifice he had made for family benefit, rather than acknowledging the obvious advantage he had gained at my expense. "Security purposes?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean like having a built-in dishwasher, in-unit laundry, 3 bedrooms, and a garden while I've been living in 400 square feet with broken appliances and drug dealers outside my window? That kind of security sacrifice?" Walking through the rest of the house revealed the full extent of Daniel's comfortable lifestyle that had been subsidized by family deception. The master bedroom contained expensive furniture and electronics that his sporadic freelance income could never have afforded. The second bedroom had been converted into an art studio with professional equipment and supplies that cost more than I earned in 3 months. The third bedroom served as a guest room with a queen-size bed and antique dresser that had belonged to our grandmother. The space looked like something from a home design magazine, with careful attention to aesthetics and comfort that represented significant time and financial investment in creating the perfect living environment. The kitchen had been updated with modern appliances while preserving its vintage charm. A new refrigerator, dishwasher, and range suggested that Daniel had not only been living rent-free, but had also been investing in property improvements that increased the home's value at no cost to himself, while I struggled to afford basic groceries. "Did you pay for these renovations yourself? Or did Mom and Dad fund the improvements to make your free housing even more comfortable?" I asked, running my hand along the granite countertops that definitely had not existed during my childhood visits with Grandmother Lily. "The updates were necessary for maintaining the property value," Daniel replied defensively, avoiding direct answers about funding sources. Mom and Dad approved the expenses because they're investments in the family's long-term financial interests. The house is worth more now than when grandmother Lily died. The admission that my parents had funded home improvements for Daniel's benefit while refusing to help with my housing crisis added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. They had actively invested money in ensuring his comfort, while watching me struggle with substandard living conditions and dangerous neighborhoods. "How much have they spent on improvements?" I demanded, though I suspected the answer would only increase my anger about the differential treatment I had received compared to Daniel's obvious preferential status within family financial decisions. "Maybe $15,000 over the past 2 years, he said quietly, apparently realizing how damaging this information would be to any attempt at justifying the situation. But that money increased the property value by at least $30,000, so it was a smart investment strategy. $15,000 in home improvements for Daniel's comfort, while I had been denied any assistance with housing costs that could have been solved for a fraction of that amount. The financial priorities revealed by this information showed exactly how little my well-being mattered compared to Daniel's lifestyle preferences and artistic pursuits. The basement had been finished with new flooring, lighting, and climate control that created additional living space Daniel used for storage and a home gym. The improvements represented professional-level renovation that had transformed the already substantial house into an even more valuable property that he enjoyed without contributing financially. "I need to sit down," I said, sinking into one of Grandmother Lily's antique chairs in the living room, where I had spent countless hours as a child, listening to her stories about our family history and values. The irony of discovering this betrayal in a space associated with some of my happiest memories made the situation even more painful. Daniel attempted to continue his explanations about property management and family financial strategy, but I was no longer listening to his rationalizations. The magnitude of the deception was becoming clear, and I needed time to process the implications for my relationship with my entire immediate family. For nearly 3 years, I had believed that my housing struggles were unavoidable consequences of economic circumstances beyond family control. Student loans, entry-level nursing salary, and Portland's expensive rental market had seemed like insurmountable challenges that required personal sacrifice and determination to overcome through individual effort. Instead, my family had owned property that could have eliminated my housing costs entirely, while allowing me to save money, reduce work hours, and focus on career development instead of survival. The opportunities I had missed because of their deception felt impossible to calculate or recover. The stress of working multiple jobs while living in unsafe conditions had affected my physical health, mental well-being, and professional development in ways that would have long-term consequences. Night shifts at the restaurant had compromised my performance during hospital shifts, limiting advancement opportunities and positive evaluations from supervisors. "Emma, I know this looks bad, but you have to understand that the decision was made based on practical considerations," Daniel continued, apparently oblivious to the depth of hurt and anger his revelations had created. "I was available to move in immediately when grandmother died, and you were still in Seattle finishing school." The timeline excuse was particularly infuriating because it ignored the fact that I had specifically asked about housing options when planning my return to Portland 3 years ago. My parents had claimed no family properties were available, while Daniel was already comfortably established in our grandmother's house. "I asked specifically about staying in grandmother's house when I was planning my move back to Portland," I said, my voice shaking with anger that was becoming impossible to control. "Mom told me the house had been sold, and there were no family housing options available. You were already living here when I had that conversation." Daniel's guilty silence confirmed that my family had lied directly to my face about housing availability, while watching me struggle to find affordable options in a city where they owned property that could have solved all my problems immediately and completely. The conversation had occurred during Christmas dinner 2.5 years ago, when I was stressed about student loan payments and worried about finding housing I could afford on an entry-level nursing salary. My mother had expressed sympathy about Portland's expensive rental market, while knowing that family property could eliminate my concerns entirely. "Why didn't anyone tell me the truth?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal motivations that were even more hurtful than the deception itself. "Why let me struggle when you had a solution readily available that would have cost the family nothing? Mom and Dad thought you needed to establish independence and learn financial responsibility," Daniel said, apparently unaware that his explanation made the situation worse rather than better. They believed that struggling would make you stronger and more appreciative of success when you achieved it through your own efforts. The paternalistic reasoning behind my family's decision to allow unnecessary suffering while providing Daniel with comfortable lifestyle felt like the ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility and fairness. They had decided that I needed hardship for character development, while protecting Daniel from similar challenges that might have taught him actual responsibility. And what exactly has Daniel learned about financial responsibility while living rent-free in a house worth over $1 million? I asked, my sarcasm barely concealing rage that was becoming dangerous to my emotional stability. How has his character been strengthened by avoiding housing costs and working sporadically when he feels like it? The double standard was so obvious and cruel that any attempt at justification only highlighted the favoritism that had characterized our family dynamics. Throughout childhood, and apparently continued into our adult lives with even more serious consequences. That's different, Daniel said weakly. I've been maintaining the property and handling responsibilities that would otherwise fall on Mom and Dad. My presence here has saved them money on property management and security services that would have been necessary. The claim that Daniel's comfortable lifestyle represented sacrifice or service to family interests was so absurd that it revealed either complete delusion or deliberate manipulation designed to avoid accountability for benefiting from unfair arrangements at my expense. Property management? I laughed bitterly. You mean living in luxury while I work double shifts to afford a studio apartment with broken appliances and safety concerns? That's your contribution to family welfare? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the front window, I could see my parents' silver Honda, which meant that Daniel had called them during our confrontation to request backup for damage control rather than handling the situation honestly. You called Mom and Dad? I asked, feeling betrayed again by Daniel's assumption that he needed protection from my legitimate anger about the situation they had all created through years of deception and favoritism that had affected every aspect of my adult life. I thought they should be here to explain their reasoning and help you understand the full situation, Daniel said, apparently believing that parental intervention would somehow make his rent-free lifestyle seem reasonable and fair to someone who had been deliberately excluded from similar benefits. Watching my parents walk up the familiar front steps of Grandmother Lily's house that I thought had been sold years ago felt surreal and heartbreaking. They moved with the casual familiarity of people who visited regularly, confirming that they had been actively involved in maintaining the deception about the property's status. My mother, Susan, entered first, her expression showing guilt mixed with defensive preparation for a difficult conversation she had probably been dreading since Daniel moved into the house. My father, Robert, followed closely behind, carrying the determined look he wore when preparing to deliver explanations that he knew would be unpopular, but considered necessary. Emma, honey, we need to talk about this situation calmly and rationally, my mother began, using the tone she had employed throughout my childhood when delivering news she knew I would not like, but expected me to accept without argument or resistance. Calmly and rationally, I said, my voice rising to levels that would have earned punishment during childhood, but felt entirely appropriate given the circumstances. You want me to be calm about discovering that you've been lying to me for years, while I worked myself to exhaustion paying rent on substandard housing. My father attempted his usual approach of logical explanation, designed to make unreasonable situations seem justified, through careful presentation of selected facts that ignored inconvenient realities. Emma, when Grandmother Lily died, we had to make quick decisions about property management and family financial security. Daniel was available to move in immediately and handle the responsibilities of maintaining a valuable asset. What about my financial security? I asked, pointing out the obvious flaw in his explanation. What about my need for affordable housing when I moved back to Portland, specifically asking for family help with accommodation? Why was Daniel's availability more important than my actual documented need? The question hung in the air, while my parents exchanged glances that suggested they had rehearsed this conversation, but had not developed satisfactory answers to obvious challenges to their reasoning or justifications for their differential treatment. We thought it would be better for your personal development to establish independence without family assistance, my mother said, delivering the same patronizing explanation Daniel had offered earlier. Young people who receive too much help often struggle with motivation and self-reliance later in life. But Daniel receiving free housing worth thousands of dollars monthly doesn't interfere with his personal development, I asked, highlighting the contradiction in their reasoning that made it clear their concern about character building applied only to me and not to their obvious favorite. Daniel's situation is different because he's providing services to the family by maintaining the property and handling responsibilities that would otherwise require professional management, my father said, apparently believing that repetition would make this explanation more convincing than it had been when Daniel offered it initially. The family meeting that followed revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had affected my life for nearly 3 years. My parents had planned Daniel's rent-free living arrangement immediately after grandmother Lily's funeral, before I had even graduated from nursing school or expressed interest in returning to Portland for employment. The decision had been presented to Daniel as temporary property management until family members could decide about selling versus keeping the house as investment property. However, no timeline had been established, and no effort had been made to transition toward alternative arrangements as my housing needs became apparent and urgent. When I had specifically asked about staying in grandmother's house during my Christmas visit, my parents had already decided that Daniel's occupancy should continue indefinitely without consideration for other family members' needs. Their claim that the house had been sold was a deliberate lie designed to prevent me from requesting accommodation that they had determined was inappropriate for my character development. "How long were you planning to continue this arrangement?" I asked, suspecting that no end date had been established, and that Daniel could have continued living rent-free indefinitely, while I struggled with housing costs that consumed most of my income and prevented any savings or career advancement. "We hadn't set a specific timeline," my mother admitted reluctantly. "We were waiting to see how everyone's situations developed before making permanent decisions about the property and its best use for family financial interests." The vague response confirmed that my housing struggles had been considered acceptable indefinitely, while Daniel's comfort remained the priority in family property decisions. No consideration had been given to the impact of their choices on my financial stability, professional development, or physical and mental health. "What about my situation?" I demanded. "When were you planning to consider my need for affordable housing or the impact of working multiple jobs on my health and career advancement? Did my well-being factor into your property management decisions at all?" The question prompted another exchange of guilty glances between my parents, suggesting that my well-being had not been a significant factor in their property management decisions or their assessment of fair family resource distribution. "We assumed you would eventually establish yourself professionally and be able to afford better housing independently," my father said, revealing that they had viewed my struggles as temporary inconvenience rather than serious hardship that could be easily resolved through family assistance they were already providing to Daniel. The assumption that my financial difficulties were temporary problems that would resolve themselves through personal effort ignored the reality of student loan payments, entry-level salaries, and Portland's housing market that made independence nearly impossible without family support or exceptional income that nursing could not provide. "Did it occur to you that having stable, affordable housing might help me establish myself professionally, instead of forcing me to work restaurant shifts that interfere with my nursing career?" I asked, pointing out how their decision had actually hindered, rather than helped, my professional development and financial stability. The revelation that my family had actively chosen to make my life more difficult while providing Daniel with advantages that eliminated comparable challenges felt like betrayal that would permanently alter our relationships and my understanding of my place within family priorities. "We can discuss adjusting the current arrangements," my mother offered, apparently believing that prospective fairness could compensate for years of differential treatment that had already affected my health, finances, career trajectory, and trust in family relationships. "Adjusting the arrangements?" I said incredulously. "You mean like charging Daniel market rate rent for living in $1 million property, or maybe offering me the guest room that I should have been living in for the past 3 years instead of that horrible apartment with safety concerns?" The suggestion that they could simply modify current arrangements ignored the fact that years of deception and favoritism had created damage that could not be easily repaired through new policies going forward or retrospective adjustments to fundamentally unfair treatment. The confrontation continued for 2 hours, with my family offering various explanations and proposed solutions that failed to address the fundamental unfairness of their decisions or acknowledge the real harm their favoritism had caused to my financial and professional situation over nearly 3 years. By the end of the meeting, several things had become clear about my family's priorities and my place within their consideration. Daniel's comfort and lifestyle preferences had consistently taken priority over my basic needs for safe, affordable housing that would have cost them nothing to provide while saving me thousands of dollars annually. Their concern about my character development had been selective, applying only when it justified denying me assistance while Daniel received comprehensive support that eliminated his need to develop actual financial responsibility or work ethic that might have prepared him for independent adult life. Most importantly, they viewed my anger about the situation as unreasonable, rather than legitimate response to years of deception and differential treatment that had affected every aspect of my adult life in Portland and damaged my ability to trust family relationships. Walking out of Grandmother Lily's house that afternoon, I realized that my relationship with my immediate family had been permanently altered by the discoveries of that day. The trust that had been broken through years of lies and favoritism could not be restored through explanations or future adjustments to arrangements that should never have existed in the first place. 3 weeks later, I made the decision that would finally prioritize my own well-being over family relationships that had consistently undervalued my needs and potential. I gave notice at both jobs, used my savings to pay moving expenses, and relocated to Seattle where nursing opportunities offered better compensation and career advancement possibilities. The decision to leave Portland meant abandoning the family relationships that had shaped my entire life, but staying would have meant accepting continued second-class status within family dynamics that would never change regardless of my achievements or contributions. Today, I work as a charge nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, earning enough to afford a beautiful one-bedroom apartment with mountain views and sufficient income for savings, professional development, and the quality of life that my family's support could have provided during those difficult years in Portland. The difference in my quality of life is remarkable and serves as daily reminder of what my family's fairness could have provided. I have energy for relationships, hobbies, and personal growth that were impossible when I was working 60-hour weeks just to afford substandard housing in an unsafe neighborhood. Daniel still lives in Grandmother Lily's house, and my parents continue viewing this arrangement as appropriate property management rather than favoritism that damaged their relationship with their daughter permanently. They occasionally call with updates about family events and expressions of hope that I will visit, but they have never acknowledged the fundamental unfairness of their treatment or offered genuine apology. The experience taught me that family relationships built on inequality and deception ultimately serve no one well, except those who benefit from preferential treatment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently demonstrate that your well-being is less important than maintaining comfortable arrangements for their favorites. What about you? Have you ever discovered that family members were receiving advantages that were denied to you? How did you handle the betrayal? And what changes did you make to protect your own interests? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics and standing up for yourself when fairness matters more than keeping peace.